Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack.
Today's guest is historian of Mexico, Dr. Martin Austin Nesvig.
Dr. Nesvig has a new book releasing in early September called The Women Who Threw Corn, Witchcraft and Inquisition in 16th-Century Mexico.
And Mexico is a new region for the show, so I'm excited to visit there in this episode.
Me too. And we're looking at an earlier era than we typically reach, the 16th century.
So join us to see what aspects of witchcraft and witchcraft accusations are similar to other stories we hear about around the world throughout time.
And which aspects are surprisingly unique.
You'll enjoy this discussion as it takes some surprising turns.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Dr. Martin Austin Nesvig. We're so happy you're here today to talk to us about 16th century Mexico in this conversation. Could you please tell us about your work and expertise?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And my name is Martin Nesvig, and I'm a historian of Mexico. And this is my third monograph. So I study Mexico, and most people, when you tell them that you study Mexico, they usually say things like, oh, tacos or tequila or conquerors or things like that. So I don't really study any of those things. I study the ways that people in Mexico reacted to Spanish religion. It is kind of one of my main areas. But this particular book is actually the first book in a planned trilogy of books about acculturation. So most of the work that's out there on acculturation in Mexico talks about, okay, so like everybody knows, like conquistador Fernando Cortez comes to Mexico, he conquers the Aztecs, and the Spaniards take over. I mean, that's kind of standard narrative. And that narrative has become much more complicated in recent years. In any case, there's a lot of people who study native people in Mexico, and they study their native language, which is Nahuatl. There's a lot of other native languages. The one that was the predominant language of the Aztecs and in central Mexico is Nahuatl. And the kind of predominant approach has been to study the ways that native peoples responded to the Spanish invasion or responded to Spanish colonialism or Spanish imperial rule or Spanish language. And so what I did is pretty much the opposite. I had studied the way that native culture influenced non-native people. And that's the basic outline of the main subject of the book. And I focused in particular on witchcraft.
So today we're talking about your new book, The Women Who Threw Corn, Witchcraft and Inquisition in 16th Century Mexico. My first question is, what does the name mean, The Women Who Threw Corn? What is that?
So that's a really good question. And the women who threw corn refers to a traditional form of, we might call it magic, but magic isn't really the right word. It was a form of divination. So it's called tlapualitl in the Nahuatl language. Tlapualitl refers to the process of growing corn or hurling corn as a way of divining events. So amongst the Nahuas and other native groups in Mesoamerica, they didn't really distinguish between magic and medicine. It didn't really have a specific difference to them. And so this throwing of corn or hurling of corn was a very important part of their sort of magic medical practice in pre-Hispanic Mexico. So the reason I titled the book that is that this is it serves as a metaphor because Spanish women and also other women who came from Spain but may have been ethnically North African or mixed or Basque, living in Mexico, they started using this corn hurling themselves. And at first, what they start to do is they pay native women to do the corn hurling. But then by the 1570s, the Spanish women are hurling the corn themselves. So the title comes from that, and it stands in as a metaphor for this process whereby Spanish women and North African women and other women adopted these native practices.
Can you tell us a little bit about that process that you mentioned? And now I'm forgetting the word.
That's okay. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Just call it corn hurling. That's what the Spanish did too, because they couldn't figure that word out either. And so they just stuck with echar suertes or echar maíz, which just means to throw corn.
And you were sharing with us about the adoption of practices and cultures to different ethnic groups. Can you explain that a little bit more to us, and just why it's really important for us to understand how women learn from each other and how they're absorbing the culture?
Well, they adopted a lot of different practices from Native women, and part of what I tried to do in this book is try to recreate the world that these women lived in, which is not easy to do because the sources are fragmentary. But obviously, the domestic space is a place where women learned from each other a lot, partly because in traditional Spanish society, women were supposed to be domestic creatures. And the domestic space is a space where they learn things. So in the kitchen, in the living space is where they learn some of these things. And so it's not surprising that some of the early forms of cultural transfer come in the form of food or everyday life, that sort of thing. And the corn hurling just happens to be one of these particular practices.
Thank you.
Are there specific regions within Mexico that you're focused on in your work?
In this particular book, it wasn't specifically regionally focused. I wrote a book some time ago that was specific to Michoacan, which is in western Mexico. But this book was driven more by the cultural practices as opposed to specific regions. And it was also driven by the availability of sources. Probably most of the material in the book comes from Mexico City, which is unsurprising because that's the major city. Even in the 16th century, it was the major city. So a lot of the material and a lot of the stories that I tell in the book come from Mexico City, which was a very large city. I mean, prior to Spanish contact, it was one of the largest cities in the world, probably bigger than most of the cities in Europe. We don't really know how many people exactly lived there, but it was an island in a lake, and then there was the kind of cities around the edge of the lake. So the island city itself probably had about 50,000 people. And then if you include the kind of the cities along the lake, Xochimilco, Coyoacán, probably like 200,000 people in the basin of Mexico. So a lot of the material comes from Mexico City. And then I also have some stories that involved Michoacan, which is to the west of Mexico City. There's some stories from Guanajuato, which was at the time a major mining producing area, and also from Zacatecas, which was the major mining city. In the colonial period, there's a case of a mulatto woman from Zacatecas, and then I also have a couple cases from Oaxaca in the south. It's kind of a combination of different regions.
And in this domestic space, the divination practices are really important. You mentioned that there's not defined separation between medicine, magic practices. Can you tell us how divination was important to them?
It was important to Native people for a variety of different reasons. It was used to figure out the origins of diseases. So in their sense of medicine, disease could be caused by sort of metaphysical things. And so the way that sometimes you would figure out the origin of diseases was through various forms of divination. The divination with the corn was often used to predict events. And it became basically a form of love magic in the colonial period. The Spanish women already had a practice of using fava beans in sexual or love magic prior to going to the Americas. So this was a kind of a well-established form of love magic was fava beans. Sometimes they would put fava beans in their mouth and they would pronounce some kind of incantation. The corn kernels were a recognizable, something that was akin to a fava bean. They're similar in size. It's kind of similar concepts. So they readily adapted to the corn throwing, but the difference was that the Spanish women used it primarily for love magic as opposed to sort of medicine magic. So it's they're doing it wrong.
So why do you think that the non-native women, the Spanish and the other women who came from outside, adopted the local practices in Mexico instead of sticking with the practices that they brought over?
We would have to ask them, and even if we could ask them, they might lie. So it's hard to know exactly. There's probably a combination of factors. One is just availability of material, that you can't use all the products from Spain because you're not in Spain, you're in Mexico. So they didn't have fava beans in Mexico. They had corn. They had what we call beans. Fava beans, I guess, are not, I don't know the exact story here, but the fava beans and beans that we think of, like beans, like black beans, those are from Mexico, but they're autochthonous to Mexico. Fava beans were European, but I think they're like in a different family or something. But they didn't have fava beans. They're like, we don't have any fava beans here. I guess we'll use this corn stuff. And so it was what was available. So a lot of it is just availability, but they still use Spanish materials. Fern seeds was like a thing, if you could believe it. For like ferns I don't know if you've ever seen ferns on the back of the fern. They've got these little things. They're like little seed pod things. They're very small and they're brown. And those were used in magic in Spain. And they got used in Mexico, at least I saw them used at least in one case. So they imported Spanish stuff and they and obviously their ideas are Spanish. They're from Spain, because in the early period, I'm talking about people that were from Spain, that were born in Spain. I mean, once you get into a later period, obviously you have people who are ethnic Spaniards born in Mexico, but most of the people I was looking at were women who were actually born in Spain. So part of it is just availability of material. The other thing is that Spaniards were a very small ethnic minority in Mexico in the 16th century. Up until the 1560s, 1570s, they were a very, very small ethnic minority in Mexico City, and outside of Mexico City, even a much smaller ethnic minority, certainly less than 20% of Mexico City. And in a lot of places outside of Mexico City, they were certainly even a smaller minority. So they're living in a primarily native world. And most of the people around them are speaking native languages. There are people speaking Spanish, and Spanish is about the official language of the colonial government. But in their everyday lives, the people around them are not necessarily Spanish. Most of them are not Spanish. And then obviously in the later period, which I don't really talk about in this book, the later period, once you get past about 1550s, 1560s, obviously it's a much more multi-ethnic world. A lot of people of mixed ethnicities, and a lot of those people cease to speak native languages. But so they're living in a native world. They're living in a predominantly non-Spanish world.
They were able to continue their traditional practices. It was just looking a little different and being enriched by the new culture they were experiencing.
Yeah, most of these women were officially Catholic. A lot of them went to Mass on a well, who knows? I mean, a lot of people didn't go to Mass even then. They were nominally Catholic, and some of them were probably Muslim, and women who were of some kind of North African background, especially in the earlier period, the 16th century, because the southern part of Spain had been under Muslim rule until the 13th century. And the very, very southern part, Granada, was under Muslim rule until 1492. And there's women who came from Granada that are in this book. And some of them are accused of being Muslims, so, who knows? But most of them are Catholic. And there's churches, they go to church, they go to Mass, all that. But even in Spain, ordinary people who were all officially Catholic, even they practiced popular religion all the time too. So they just adapted to their circumstances and started using native forms of magic.
Did Mexico see any large witch hunts or witch crazes like happened in Europe?
There were no witch crazes in Mexico, and there were no witch hunts. There were, in the whole history of Mexico and the Inquisition and the witch hunts, they didn't burn any witches. The Inquisition, people were executed for other kinds of crimes, but there weren't really any actual witch crazes. It depends on your definition of a witch craze. The people that study witch crazes or witch hunts in Europe usually say that in order for it to be a craze, like there have to be large numbers of people who were pulled into the courts and interrogated, and large numbers of people that were executed. And that never happened in Mexico. The ones in Spain that are famous, like the Sugaramundi case from 1609, 1610, is the one with the goat, and Goya painted a painting of it. That was a witch craze. But the big numbers are in Germany. That's where all the people, that was like the place where the most people got killed for being accused of witchcraft, was in Germany. But in Mexico, nobody gets executed for being a witch. Women do get in trouble, they get investigated, they get interrogated, but nobody gets executed. So there's no witch crazes in Mexico. It's just not a thing.
When I was reading, I noticed that you pointed out that some of the women who did find themselves in the place of accusation were very exotic or exceptional and perceived as exceptional. Although there is the whole discussion on vulnerable and people desperate in society finding themselves in accusations, we also have seen lots of cases in colonial U.S. where the complaint was that the woman was exceptional or beautiful. And I saw, oh, that is a common thread there.
Sure, that definitely happens in Mexico, that women who are considered ethnically different or who are considered oversexed are often accused of being witches. This is a pretty common, as you mentioned, this is pretty common throughout all the different kinds of witch crazes and witch hunts or inquisitions. There have been studies also that suggest that widows also are particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. And at least in the context of the Hispanic world, part of the reason is that they don't have any family to protect them. So the women that tend to get accused are either single women, widows, women who are perceived as being different, women who are perceived as being oversexed. It's very common. And this, in the case in Mexico, and this is similar to Spain, but in Mexico, a lot of the women who get accused of being witches are women who are of mixed ethnicity. So they're either from southern Spain, which had a larger or longer term impact of Muslim and North African culture, because the southern part of Spain, especially Andalusia, was under Muslim rule until the middle of the 13th century. So for 500 years, it was under Muslim rule. And then Granada was under Muslim rule until 1492. A lot of these women are they're from Andalusia, southern Spain, which is where Seville and Granada and Cordoba are located. There are all kinds of stereotypes back in the day in the 16th century that women from Andalusia were oversexed. They also tend to be darker skinned. And then you have this other group called Moriscas, which is a kind of a term that sort of doesn't mean anything to the extent that it can mean a lot of different things. It can have a sort of a religious designation, which means it could refer to somebody who had been a Muslim and had converted to Catholicism. It could just mean someone who was of some kind of vaguely dark-skinned, vaguely North African look. That could be a Morisca. It could also be just a woman who was enslaved in Spanish expeditions and invasions of North Africa in the 16th century, and from Tunis and other places. Women in Algiers, women were captured and sold into slavery and brought back to Spain, and actually Morisca women were highly valued as slaves for their perceived good looks. So there's a lot of these women. And then, of course, there are There are enslaved sub-Saharan Africans in Mexico, though in the period that I'm looking at, the numbers are not gigantic, but the women that got accused of witchcraft that we know about who were sub-Saharan African is mid-1536, when these women were almost certainly from Senegambia, because the transatlantic slave trade at that time in the 1530s, pretty much, basically almost all of the women, or almost all of the people enslaved from Africa were from Senegambia or Guinea coast, which is just next to Senegal. So they were from that region. And then there were women from the Canary Islands, and women from Canary Islands were also seen as being oversexed. They were also of uncertain ethnicity. They're probably mostly Spanish, though, because the native people of the Canary Islands were called the Guanches, and they were largely exterminated by the Spaniards in sort of wars of extermination. But there were almost certainly some sexual, I don't know what to, procreation, I guess is the only word for it, because marriage isn't really the right word. So there were children that were the result of some kind of sexual interaction between Spanish men and Guanche women, but I don't really seem to know that much about the Guanches in terms of their survival.
The oversexed category of women, is that a religious judgment? Does that have to do with the diabolical pact, or is it just a cultural, non-religious behavior?
I think it's probably just mostly a cultural thing. People do get accused of making pacts with the devil, but it's not necessarily sexual. Actually, usually it isn't sexual. Women, men get accused of having pacts with the devil, but usually it's having a pact with the devil to get something concrete, to find something, or just have a better life, or to be a better. There's cases of these guys that have pacts with the devil because the devil promises that he will protect them when he's riding on horseback, or make him a better rancher, stuff like that. It's usually a lot more uninteresting and banal in most of the cases that I've seen. So the women also have pacts with the devil, but it's usually like to get stuff. You also have cases where people make pacts with the devil because they say, I tried these other saints and those losers didn't do me any good. So I changed teams to the devil and see what the devil had to offer. So that's actually pretty common too. So there's the kind of pact with the devil business, but a lot of these women are just accused of being oversexed. So it's classic old-fashioned slut shaming.
Yeah.
It's just like, these women are accused of being oversexed. They've got too many sexual partners. Spanish has a bunch of different words for women that don't fit into acceptable sexual categories, but the prostitute, prostituta, isn't one of those words in the 16th century. It's not a word that they use. They've got lots of other words that they use. And in the phrase that I saw that was really interesting that got applied to two different women is mujer enamorada, which literally means a woman in love. It meant, I translated it as courtesan because it's the closest thing in English I think that we can come up with, because it doesn't really mean prostitute in the sense of a sex worker, and it doesn't mean a street walking prostitute, because there was a name for that called cantonera, which meant a corner. It literally meant a corner person. So they had a word for that. It was a cantonera. So it wasn't that. It wasn't puta, which is whore, and it wasn't ramera, which also means whore, and it wasn't meretrix, which is a Latin word, but it was used in Spanish. And meretrix, from which we get meretricious, was basically just like meretricious person. It just means like you engage in sex for money. So a mujer enamorada was something else. It wasn't any of those categories. So what it seemed to imply was sort of like a woman who had sexual relationships with men for some kind of social, political, economic, cultural gain, but not just like, here's $500 for an hour of sex. It wasn't like that. This was a different kind of category. So there were these women accused of being mujer enamoradas, which is like the courtesan, and a lot of times, and then they got accused of being witches at the same time.
In the book, you talk about how in Spain, a lot of the witch trials were handled by the royal courts, but the Inquisition got interested in this demonic pact thing, the Satanic Pact. In Mexico, were these cases handled largely by the civil authorities, or was the Inquisition always involved?
We don't really know because a lot of the documentation from the civil courts for the very early period in the 16th century doesn't exist anymore. There are hints of trials against women that were undertaken by the civil authorities in Mexico. So we know that they did. The first woman ever, at least on record, the first woman accused of being a witch, Inés de las Casas, was accused of being a witch and was prosecuted, was previously tried by the civil magistrate of Mexico City. The case file doesn't exist anymore, but it's referred to in her later inquisitional trial. So we know that the civil authority had some kind of jurisdiction over sorcery and witchcraft, but we don't really know the extent of these trials. It doesn't seem like there were that many because there would have been somebody else contemporaneously would have mentioned these trials. All we know is that the civil authority had some jurisdiction. They probably punished some people, but we don't know how many because the records aren't there. But the inquisitional material is there. And so the inquisitional authorities started prosecuting women for sorcery in the 1530s in Mexico. And then in 1571, there was a central office of the Inquisition that was established in the Americas, one in Lima and one in Mexico City. And when that happened, this new bureaucratically centralized Inquisition quashed all the jurisdictions of all these other individual inquisitions. So a central Inquisition was set up in 1571, and it also continued to pursue witchcraft, but it didn't really prosecute that many people. If you look at the post-1571 data, which I didn't use for this book, but if you look at that data, and I have studied it in the past, there are hundreds of these people go and they snitch on their neighbor, and it's usually because they don't like the person. Is not a very original story. They go and they snitch on the neighbor, they snitch on somebody they don't like, and they say, oh, so-and-so Maria Suarez is a witch. And so they what did she do? How do you know she's a witch? What's going on? And they send off the denunciation off to Mexico City. This is post-1571. And usually the inquisitors are like, whatever, we don't really care. We're busy looking for Jews. That was what they really cared about, was Jews and Lutherans. So like they get these denunciations against women for being witches, and they're just like, whatever, they don't really care. So there are cases. There's like a little spike in the 1570s, and there's another little spike in the 1590s of women who get actually prosecuted. The Inquisition actually has them arrested. They go to jail. They get interrogated. There's a trial. Witnesses are called, and then they get punished. So there is a little spike, but we're not talking huge numbers. We're talking like in a decade, less than 100, just like a couple dozen in a decade. So the inquisitors in Mexico are pretty skeptical about that. Mostly, like most of the most of the Spanish writers, theologians, and jurists, and they mostly don't think witchcraft is real. They mostly just think witchcraft's not. They're like, no, that's not real. There aren't any witches. That's just like stupid superstition. They're superstitious country people who believe in witches. So the people in charge of getting rid of witchcraft didn't really believe that it was really real anyway. They were just like, no, that's not real. The Inquisition usually, when it gets involved in these cases, is usually because there's something to do with like the devil. That's usually when people get in big giant trouble. It's like, oh, the devil's involved, or these women are mixing the sacred with the profane, then they're in trouble. But if it's just like plain old superstition, they're just like, whatever, we don't care.
Yeah, so it was really about punishing for mixing the sacred with the profane and not so much a purification. Because I was thinking about the craze histories, and there's usually this really big rooting out and purification goal happening, but it sounds like they were doing that in the scene world with cultures and specific ethnicities and religions versus the on-scene world of the diabolical.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, in Mexico, they were skeptical of this. A lot of times, like, for example, in France and in Germany, the big witch crazes there usually happen when the usual story was there'd be some bishop, and the bishop would come to power, and he would blame all of society's ills on Lutheranism. And they would have to find a scapegoat, and the scapegoats were women, and they would accuse them. And then you get like this whole like kind of the psychology of the witch craze, where like all of a sudden everybody's finding witches everywhere where they don't exist. What's his name? This guy wrote this book called The Looming Tower. Now I forgot his last name. He wrote a previous book about the witch craze in the 1980s in Los Angeles. There were these people who ran a daycare center, and everybody accused them of being satanic pedophiles.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same story, but these kinds of things don't seem to happen in Mexico. I've never seen it happen there are little instances of this happening where there's a little group in a little location, and all of a sudden everybody's denouncing one or two different women as being witches. So it does happen, but it's on a much smaller scale than you see even of Salem. It's much smaller scale than that. So it happens, but when people get really in trouble, it's usually because they get accused of doing something with the devil. A lot of these women that I studied, that I wrote about in this book, they were investigated because they were doing things that seemed kind of vaguely diabolical. They were using certain herbs or certain potions. One of the things that was supposed to be really bad was you weren't supposed to ascribe any particular power to nighttime or daytime per se. A lot of the spells had to be performed at nighttime, and this was considered bad, or that it had to be a certain stage of the moon or things like this. And that was considered bad, but it wasn't really considered satanic per se. But then they would investigate. They want to find out, like, is this really about the devil? And a lot of times these women would say, no, it's not about the devil, dude. Like, what's with the devil? I'm just trying to do whatever. Midwives were frequently the target of investigation because they're involved with babies and they're intimate with other women. I mean, not sexually intimate, but they're intimate because they're delivering babies. That's pretty intimate. Then they're using herbs and poultices, and so those women also get scrutinized a lot.
Now, one of the ingredients or items that was being used in magic was vaginal bathwater.
Right.
Can you explain where that came from and what was the purpose?
Vaginal bathwater, as well as menstrual blood, which there was a case that I unfortunately literally ended up on the cutting room floor, which I'm going to turn into an article.
Yay.
But yeah. So vaginal bathwater and menstrual blood seem to be European. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that this is a native phenomenon. This seems to be a European phenomenon. We don't really know where it's from. There seems to be some suggestion that this was something that was particular to the Canary Islands. Whether that means it was only in the Canary Islands or just was more well known in the Canary Islands, it's hard to know, but it's definitely European. And the idea is that this would create some kind of metaphysical link between the woman and the man. So the idea is that you're mixing these intimate substances, vaginal bathwater or menstrual blood, with the food, some kind of food or drink that the man is going to ingest. And by ingesting this, he will become linked to the woman. And once you get past the 1571, there's a lot more information about this. There seems to be a few different reasons that women do this. One is the idea is to get the man to fall in love with it. So that's the oldest one in the book is do this, the man will fall in love with me, and he will be tethered to me. The other reason that women seem to do this is that they are being abused physically by their husband, boyfriend, partner, or whatever. And the idea is that this will get them to stop beating them. In either case, it's about controlling or taming the man with these substances. But there's at least in the Spanish case, there's other cases that involve spells, that involve urine mixed with like vinegar and stuff like this. But at its core, this is a kind of a form of love magic or sexual magic that's supposed to tie the man to the woman. And I don't think we're talking about like huge quantities. I think the idea is that it's like a little bit. Just, although I've read some cases that were pretty graphic, and it sounds like there was some kind of, I don't know how to even try to, it's like in one case, this guy thought that it was like a kind of a piece of dried, I don't know if you've ever seen what happens to chili peppers, the dried chili peppers, and then you reconstitute them in water. He thought that it was that. And I'm trying to think like what must have been really thick menstrual blood or something. I don't know, like really stringy. I don't know. And then apparently he puked. So it didn't work. But the reason it didn't work on him was that A, it was the wrong guy, and B, he knew about it. So that the whole point is that this is supposed to be secret, that the man isn't even supposed to know, because I think probably in most cases, if a woman brought the guy like a stew or a cup of chocolate and said, oh, by the way, I mixed in some menstrual blood there just for fun, most men would probably be like, I think I'm going to pass. No thanks. It's probably some that would be like, yum, but I think most people would be like, no, it's gross. Pass. So the whole point was that this had to be secret. But you couldn't really get in trouble for this. And I never really saw any woman actually get in trouble for doing that. They just say, that's gross. Don't do that.
What kind of records would these stories be in?
These are the ones that I've seen these are in Inquisition investigations. The one that I used in the book came from Guanajuato, which is a mining town. It's north central Mexico, or central Mexico. It's north of Mexico City. It's like about a 6-hour drive. And it was a woman who was from the Canary Islands, and she had mixed her vaginal bathwater in some mustard with this guy. But this was all part of a inquisitional trial. She was put on trial for being a witch. And that was one of the bad things that she did, supposedly. She denied it, of course, but everybody else said she did it.
Another type of magic that you talk about is freedom magic. Can you give us some background on what that is and how that was used?
Yeah, that was really interesting. When I was finishing the research and writing this book, I hadn't really come across this, or maybe I just am ignorant, which is true, but maybe I was particularly ignorant of this, that there were cases of women who were enslaved and they wanted to not be slaves anymore, because it seems pretty obvious being a slave has got to be terrible. And there were these cases of these women, some who used spells to convince their owners to set them free. And in some cases, these women said it worked. And what's interesting is that in at least a couple of cases, these spells were sex magic spells. So it's like a combination of sex magic, freedom magic. In some cases, the women who were slaves were basically sexual slaves. They were domestic slaves, but they were subjected to, well, by definition, rape, because you can't consent if you're a slave. But in some cases, these women talk about their owners in language that it's very difficult to talk about, because they don't want to be accused of minimizing how terrible it is to be a slave. But some of these women talk about their masters as if they were sort of their lovers. And they sometimes talk about how they used love magic to convince their master to set them free. In other cases, there's clearly no relationship, coerced or consensual or not, between the woman and her male owner, but that she still heard about this way that you could convince your owner to set you free. It's a little bit unclear, the mechanics of how this is supposed to work. But this was apparently a thing. Like there were cases of women who paid. One of the things that you could do in the slave system in the Hispanic world, you could theoretically buy your way out of freedom. It's not especially easy, but you could, in theory, get a job and work and earn money and try to pay your way out of slavery. And I guess in some cases, these women would pay other women that they had heard. Oh, I heard that this woman was a very powerful sorceress, and I paid her to cast these spells on my owner to convince him to write a letter of manumission. So it seems to be a thing, which I didn't know was a thing. But it was a little unclear to me. The investigations don't really indicate exactly how this is supposed to work. Just like that they cast a spell on the guy, and the guy, in theory, is supposed to let them go. And then there's other cases where women say, "Oh, I paid you dues and it didn't work," and then the woman accused said, "Oh, I'm not really a witch. I just conned these people out of their money."
And they were prosecuting cons as well.
Sometimes not for being cons, but for being witches. And then, of course, even if you are a witch, you're probably not going to admit it. You're like, "No, I'm not a witch. I just scammed these people out of their money." Maybe they were a witch, but I guess you don't really want to say, like, "Oh yeah, I'm a witch." Not really a winning strategy in jail, waiting trial. So of course they're going to say I'm not a witch, but who knows? For me, it was immaterial whether these people were witches or not. I was more interested in what this tells us about the culture. But some of them probably were witches in the sense that they did tell people that they could cast spells, and because there was monetary value associated with spell casting. Like, it wasn't free. Couldn't just be like, "Hey, can you cast a spell for me because you're my friend?" It was like, no, it doesn't work that way. You have to pay me to cast the spells. And this was something that women made money doing.
And did you see spells being purchased to protect from the evil eye?
I didn't see any spells for people to protect from the evil eye, but there were a lot of women who said that that so-and-so cured their child of the evil eye. There was a couple different, actually, midwives, at least in the documents that I looked at. The people that were most intimately associated with curing the evil eye were midwives. But there were other sorceresses in Spain who also could claim that they could cure the evil eye. I'm not sure if I didn't see anyone actually trying to proactively prevent the evil eye. Usually it was just like, don't look at women. Especially old women. Don't look at old women, and don't let little kids look at old women. Apparently that was like the worst possible scenario for evil eye, was post-menopausal women looking at young babies. You were totally doomed. But there were these women who claimed to cure the evil eye. There were all kinds of weird ways that they claimed to cure the evil eye. It involved making these incantations and sometimes making poultices out of different kinds of plants or materials. There were like the sort of curing of the evil eye. But I didn't see anybody trying to get like a anti-evil eye potion or anything like that, or amulet. I haven't seen any amulets against the evil eye, even though those are big now. They were Cuban originally, but now they're everywhere. Big giant eye, kind of blue iris eye. You see them all the time now. But that's like an anti-evil eye amulet. Neapolitans also have anti-evil eye. It's the evil eye concept was widespread in Catholic Europe, even to this day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see any protect me from the evil eye in the future. It was more like, my son has an evil eye. Can you please make him better? So there were midwives who apparently that was one of the things they could do, was cure the evil eye, which was considered bad. The official line was, trying to cure people of the metaphysical evil eye was bad because it was superstitious. Because people, even like people who wrote treatises, said, well, there's evil eye, what we would call probably conjunctivitis, so like infections of the eye, which are caused by natural things. And then there's like the evil eye, which is like caused by someone looking at you at a certain way. And that didn't necessarily result in your eyes getting, like, the evil eye, when it happens to you, doesn't necessarily make your eyes go bad. It's like it makes you puke, or it makes you sick in general. But it comes from the eye. So there's two different things. But apparently curing the evil eye involved things that didn't necessarily involve the eyes. It's like the evil from the eye, it comes from the eye, and then it goes into the person's, I don't know, goes into their soul or something, and then it manifests itself in the body. I'm not really sure how it works.
Yeah, they had a similar concept in the Salem witch trials, according to one of the critics, was that what he called effluvia came out of
right.
and it went into the person. And then if the if they touched the witch, then it would go back to the witch.
Oh,
Yeah.
I haven't heard about that one. The effluvia idea was around, and the Spanish people believed in the effluvia idea. There was a guy, one of the guys that I studied, this guy Martín de Arles, who was Spanish, but he was from the Basque region. But I don't think he was ethnically Basque, but he was. He wrote a anti-superstition treatise back in the very early 1500s, and he's got a whole section on the evil eye. And he says the evil eye comes out of the eyes, and it's like effluvia. And this is why he said that postmenopausal women were especially dangerous, because they were no longer purging through menstruation. Therefore, all these toxins were building up in their body, and the way that they were let loose was through the eyes. And he said that sometimes menstruating women, if they looked at a mirror a certain way, could make the mirror have spots.
Wow.
Which totally, I know, we just think that sounds super crazy, but this was apparently, and so he said that postmenopausal women were especially dangerous because they had all this built up toxin and they could project it. And so the people who were most at risk were young children, like babies and young children, because they were soft and tender, because they were defenseless against the evil effluvia coming out of the eyes of the evil postmenopausal women. And I guess I don't know, in a sort of weird way, there's a certain bizarre logic, because at this time, a lot of people didn't live to menopause. Life expectancy was not really that, probably 30 years old. Most women didn't live to make it to menopause. Most women were dead by then. So probably not a lot of postmenopausal women running around 16th century Mexico or Spain, because most of the people are dead before then.
Yeah. And I think the elderly have behaviors, sometimes from health, sometimes it's just from wisdom and long life, but that are misunderstood by younger generations. And I think today, in some communities where elderly are finding themselves accused, getting the gray hair and entering that phase of life starts to put suspicion around them in communities today, even.
If you look at the 17th century, where there's just like this oceans of documentation for Mexico, if you look at the kinds of women who get accused of being witches in the 17th century, a lot of them you see a lot of things like widows, younger women who are not married, women who are somewhere, probably sex workers of some sort. But widows are a popular target. And one of the reasons is that they're perceived as easier targets, stuff like that. There was this crazy idea that widows had wandering wombs. In fact, this was like a popular concept, that they were like walking around with these hungry wombs. It was dangerous because I don't know what they would do. But this was like a thing. This was like an idea that people had. So the widows were easy targets.
Would you like to tell our audience how they can get a hold of your wonderful book?
Well, the book is available on Amazon. It goes on sale on September 4th. So 2 weeks from today, I think, it goes on sale in the United States. It's been available in the UK since July. They made a really nice cover for it, which is nice. Also, we never did get to talk about peyote, but peyote is something that makes its appearance in this book. So peyote is from Mexico. It's autochthonous to Mexico. That's where it originally came from. And people have been eating peyote for a long time. There's carbon dating of excrement or whatever that proves that people have been eating it for thousands of years. And it starts showing up in witchcraft cases. That's the first place it shows up in the documentation, is in witchcraft documentation. So I have, in this book, there's a couple chapters that talk about the first two women who get accused of being involved with peyote. The first one is a midwife who is of some uncertain ethnicity. She's described as a mulatto, which means black and white or African and Spanish mix. But her mother may have been North African. We don't really know. But she was wealthy. She had a wealthy father. She migrated to Mexico and she worked as a midwife. And she didn't herself eat peyote, but she was living in Zacatecas, which is one of the main areas where peyote naturally grows. But she paid some indigenous men to eat peyote because she herself had slaves. She had these 2 slaves. They were native girls, and they ran away. And she wanted to know where these girls had gone. So she paid these guys to eat peyote because the idea was eat the peyote spirit will tell you. And then in 1569 in Guanajuato, which is a mining town like Zacatecas, but further south, and also an area where peyote grows, this woman, Catalina de Peraza, who was from the Canary Islands, she ate peyote. And I guess maybe she didn't, but if she didn't, someone just exactly like her ate it, because there's all these testimonies of people talking about her eating peyote. So these are the very first cases of people who are not natives eating peyote and tripping out. But they were doing it wrong. So they were doing it to predict things. And in her case, she wanted to know if this guy who was the local magistrate wanted to marry her or not. And then I guess this peyote told her that he didn't. And then she cast spells on him to get revenge. So this is the beginning of people using hallucinogens in the Americas who are not native peoples. People started eating shrooms too, but that's for a different book. So the third book in this sort of projected trilogy of books is about hallucinogens. So it's mostly about peyote and shrooms, which are psilocybe mushrooms. People today just call them shrooms. Those are also from Mexico. They're autochthonous to Mexico. That's where they originally came from. You can grow them anywhere now. All you need are the spores to grow them. People grow them at home. People have been eating shrooms for a long time too. And the cases against Spaniards or non-native peoples don't start showing up until the 17th century. But there are cases of people eating shrooms and they get in trouble, but not necessarily for eating shrooms. They get in trouble for casting spells and other bad things. And then it's like, oh, by the way, you ate shrooms. That's also bad. Don't do that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for producing work like this. As you pointed out, you're building context that's not necessarily been built in the same way. So it's so informative, and it brings humanity out of the dusty pages of the past and helps us reflect on ourselves. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We want to thank you for joining us and for keeping the conversation going by sharing what you've learned with your friends and family.
We can't wait to see you in a few days at our weekend podcast, The Thing About Salem.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.